Welcome to another Youth-Centered podcast. This is number 14 in our series, and I'm very excited to have our guest today, a former kid in our program. I've known him since he was a young lad in our summer fun program, all the way up, obviously, to his times working with us here. So I have Jimmy Warden as our guest today. Jimmy, thanks for coming on the Youth-Centered podcast.
Thanks for having me, Rick. I'm really excited to be here.
Jimmy, as we said, I've known you since you were a young guy. Tell our listeners a little bit that don't know Jimmy Warden, because you are out of town right now. Give us a little Jimmy Warden story, starting back when you were that young little kid.
So my family and I, we moved here the summer of 2002, so I was entering the third grade. So that's where I started. I went to Atkinson Elementary School, moved up to North Andover Middle School, onto the high school, and as you mentioned, throughout the summers, was definitely a big fan of the summer fun program, participated in the Joseph Walsh Summer League basketball as well.
So, Jimmy, what would you say some of your fondest memories of growing up in North Andover, whether it be, sports, hanging out with your friends, school?
Well, definitely those times at summer fun, those definitely stick out. I still have some very vivid memories, even though, they were at least probably over even 15 years ago now. Some of the memories. Definitely the summer league basketball as well. Some very vivid memories of that, and honestly, working here as well. That kind of progression, so to say. Being a camper and then kind of being on the other end of the spectrum and seeing what you can do within being a counselor, and just seeing how that works as well, and kind of coming around with that, and really just having a tremendous impact on kids and really seeing what that can do. That was
You actually started out, obviously, working in our building here and then working at Summer Fun, and then you finished with us. You were actually an assistant coordinator at Drummond. What was the growth process in working for us like?
well, it was interesting at first. It was different just because you are on that other end of the perspective. You really have to hold yourself accountable because you really are the role model, so to say, when you're working here. No matter whether or not you want it to happen or not, kids do look up to you, regardless of who you are and what your life is like. That's just kind of the environment and the culture that's created here. So it was really cool to definitely have that as my role, so to say, and really just trying to fully understand that as much as I could, even at a younger age, in high school, just knowing that I could have that impact and really just trying to carry myself to a higher standard. That way, kids could look up to a great role model.
Absolutely. You were a student athlete at North Andover High School. What were some of maybe, if you can think back, what were some of the pros and cons of being a student athlete? Maybe pros and cons isn't the correct word, but obviously it's a huge commitment to be a strong student, which you were, as well as an athlete, and you played up to 2 to 3 sports a year. What was that like?
Well, like you said, it was definitely a lot of time management because I was involved in so many different things. It was definitely worth it. In the end, it's really just trying to do your best as an individual to carve out time to make sure that your academics are up to par, and just making sure that it doesn't interfere. Like sometimes, even in younger ages, kids, they might feel like, oh, I'm playing this sport, my academics, they're kind of taking a back seat right now, but you really, really need to make sure that the academics are really coming first. That way, if you are fortunate enough to continue your athletic career after high school, that you're not passed over because of a lack of academic success. So that was really a big component for me, is really just trying to have that time management balance, multi sports as well as the academics, and really just trying to make the most out of both experiences.
Sure. Upon graduation, you headed up to Vermont and Norwich University as a recruited basketball player. What was it like to leave North Andover and head up to Vermont, to a school that a lot of people don't even know is at least a half military school? You obviously weren't in the Corps, but what was that whole experience going from little North Andover up to a great town, Northfield, Vermont?
It was a little bit of a culture shock. It's in the sense that North Andover, a lot of people do think of it as a, small town, but there was a little bit more to offer as far as, the social component went, places to go to eat, just activities to do. So that was a little bit of a change. Also, just being far away from home, I definitely consider myself a homebody. Norwich is about 2.5 hours from North Andover, so just not always having the convenience to necessarily come home for a weekend or so. That was a little bit of a struggle. Like, I definitely got homesick a lot my freshman year, but as you said, I think the basketball really helped in the sense that it took my mind off of that homesickness, and I really felt like that was a second family in itself. Really, just making those bonds with my basketball teammates.
Sure. And you ended up doing something that not many people do or can do. You actually played two college sports up at Norwich. So, if I'm correct, it was maybe after your first year you joined the lacrosse program also. The seasons back up to each other, which can be a bit stressful also. What was it like actually playing two college sports?
It was definitely a whirlwind at times, like you said. The sports are back to back, and yes, as you were definitely correct, is after my freshman year, I played just basketball. That fall of my sophomore year, I met some of the lacrosse players, and it just kind of came up in conversation. And I was like, "Yeah, I used to play lacrosse in high school." And they were like, "Well, what are you doing? Why don't you come try out?" And I said, "I don't know if I'm really that good." And so they came to some of the basketball games. They felt like I was athletic enough to make the team, and I ended up making the team, and it was so much fun, and it was definitely a great decision on my end. Despite the fact that it got a little chaotic as far as the time management went. Just like you said, totally engulfed in sports as well as the academic piece of it. But it was a good busy, so to say, and I definitely do not regret the decision to play two sports. It was a phenomenal experience.
So Norwich is a pretty demanding academic school also, and we're going to talk a little bit later. You actually ended up getting two degrees, two bachelor's degrees from Norwich. So how was that? Was that time management something you really had down to a science? Was it stressful at times? What were the most difficult times of playing two sports, trying to maintain your academic excellence up at Norwich?
Well, it was at points I definitely felt like I had it down to a science, but it definitely wasn't perfect. There were definitely some long nights in the computer labs, and sometimes pulling all nighters towards the finals time of come springtime when you're taking your finals for your classes. But I really did try to do I was pretty aware of trying to get my work done first, because I tried to take as many morning classes as I could. That way I had a chunk of time in the afternoon to get through any assignments before practice. That way, because you're going out there and you're practicing hard, you're physically exhausting your body and your brain as well, and it comes to a point where after practice, mentally you're not really wanting to do much of anything besides just relax and maybe get a little bite to eat and get some sleep. So I really tried to be aware of how much work I had to do and my due dates. But yes, there were definitely some times where the time management was a little bit of a struggle. But again, at the end of the day, it was all worth it.
Yeah, I have a lot of respect for you. As you know, my son Michael was a talented basketball player, played 4 years of basketball, and I know what that time commitment was all about. And to even think about him playing two sports, I'm not sure he could have really done it with the academics, but you did obviously an impressive job on that. And there are a few of our kids out there that actually are playing two college sports, so I hope they're listening here today to hear some of those comments from Jimmy. Jimmy, upon graduating from Norwich, you got your first teaching and coaching job in Vermont. Take us through how that actually started and how it actually followed through in terms of not coming south back home to us and staying up there in the Green Mountain State.
Yeah. So it was just kind of came to a point where I was doing my student teaching, and I just felt like Vermont had more opportunity. It offered me more opportunity, at least to kind of get going within those careers right away. And I felt like, at least for me, I know a lot of people learn differently, but I know I learn best through experience. So I felt like I really just kind of had to, take advantage of some potential opportunities up in Vermont and really dive headfirst into it. It was, it was a little tough at first because I went through the interview process in my student teaching. I went and I took an interview there at the school that I student taught at, Didn't get the job, so I was a little down on myself, but I was fortunate enough, that next job interview, I was lucky enough to get the feedback from my first job interview as far as, pros and cons and things that I did well, things that I might not have done so well. So I took that feedback into my next job interview and was able to accept a job after that second interview. And it's really been a great climate there. It's the Washington Village School up in Washington, Vermont, super small town. Honestly, I think there's only about 1,000 residents in the entire town, 100 kids in the school. But it's just a phenomenal place to be. It's almost like a small family. The school in itself, everybody knows everybody, everybody's looking out for each other, and it's just a really positive environment. And then as far as coaching goes, I have to give all the credit to Dan Gothy. A quick shout out to Disco Dan. He was an assistant coach at Norwich while I was a player, so that's how Dan and I first got connected. And him and I stayed in touch throughout the years. And then he touched base with me when he realized that I was staying up this way. When I say this way, up in Vermont, and he asked me to first just be an assistant coach with the varsity team. And then a few things happened, with his staff. So then I was actually fortunate enough to be the head coach of the junior varsity U32 Raiders at U32 High School, as well as assist him at the varsity level. So super fortunate for that, and big thanks to Dan for that opportunity.
I've been very close with Disco a number of years. Obviously, got to know him when he was recruiting a bunch of my kids down here for Norwich, and very happy for him. He's taken over this U32 program and doing some great stuff. We often talk about culture and how to build a program, and wish him the best. And I was ecstatic that he took you on staff. I think you can learn a lot from Disco, and I think you're going to do great over there. You have started a little thing called a Wednesday Wisdom, your own little podcast. I heard that you actually started up after you heard one of the first Youth Senate podcasts, so
Yeah.
we'll take a little credit for starting yours. You got a thing called Wednesday's Wisdom with Jimmy on social media. I've actually been listening to it every week. I think it's really good. Your most recent one, Letting Go, we're going to talk a little bit about as we continue on this. But what was the reason you really wanted to do this, and what are you hoping to do with it? And who are you reaching out to? Do you get some feedback from people when they do hear the Wednesday Wisdom with Jimmy?
Well, first of all, I want to say thank you for listening. But my whole thought process with that was really just trying to reach out to people to just give them a different perspective on various life topics and adversities that one may be facing within life. I just noticed that, I consider myself a pretty positive, pretty upbeat person. And, unfortunately, there is, a lot of negativity in the world, not only just with events happening, but, with the thoughts that are going on in people's head. I come across a lot of people with like a lot of negative self-talk, and at the end of the day, that's not necessarily going to help you in any way. So I think my big overarching goal with that podcast is to really just kind of have people that have those negative self-talk, those thoughts in their head, kind of that internal voice, really just trying to shift it the other way and try to become more positive within oneself, just to create a more positive energy and just a more overall positive life and lifestyle, and just a more overall level of happiness in life. Because I think a lot of it is prefaced on how you think. So just trying to give them a little bit of different perspectives on how to think about certain things and how to approach them, and try to give them some tips on what they can do a little bit differently than what they're already doing. As far as the direction that I want it to go, we'll kind of see where it goes. I'm not necessarily doing it to, become rich and famous per se, but really just trying to reach out to those people that need it. That's really my biggest goal, is that people that are soaking it in, I'm just really hoping that they can take away a few nuggets of knowledge or wisdom in this case, and really try to apply some of those strategies and those tips that I give them, because I really try to think that it's pretty practical and very reasonable ways that you can go about it. And as far as the feedback, everybody that does listen, it's been nothing but positive, and I'm always open to, hearing new ideas of things to talk about, just as you are on your podcast. I think that's something that's really awesome, is that, you want to please those that are listening, and I'm definitely open to any new ideas as far as that
And
goes.
how many have you done already?
Um, honestly, I think offhand, I think maybe a half dozen. I actually, um, it's tough. I try to do one every week, but as it goes, it's can be difficult.
Sure.
A full time job, trying to juggle it all, so to say. But I think about a half dozen, so six, maybe seven. I'm not quite sure. I actually just recently came out with one this past Wednesday. Just some tips on how to become a better listener, just because that's something that I've been trying to do. I'm definitely very outspoken, and I definitely like to talk myself. But I think the key to a great conversation is really having the ability to be an active listener, and that's a lot different than what people might think at first. So if you want any tips on how to become a better listener, they can definitely check that out. Wednesday Wisdom, a few tips on how to become a better listener and just have richer, more enjoyable conversations with people.
And give yourself a little shameless plug. How can our listeners catch this?
So I run it through an app called Anchor. You can download the app Anchor on your smartphone, tablet. Also on several different platforms as you are. One of them being Anchor as well as Podbean. I believe I'm on Google Play. I'm not quite sure. I'm
Yes,
not
you are. That's how I heard your latest one was on Google
Well,
Play.
that's awesome. And like I said, I'm just doing it for the people. And also at the Apple Podcasts as well on iPhones, iPads, anything Apple related. You can catch it through the Apple Podcast app as well.
That's great. Jimmy, what's the most rewarding thing about teaching? You're finished up your first year. You're obviously learning the ropes in a lot of ways. We talked off air about a lot of professional development stuff that I'm proud of you that you're doing to become a better person and a better teacher. What's that first year rewards for you?
It's just knowing that you had an impact, knowing that you made a difference. For me, especially since I'm working with kids that are elementary age, mostly fourth and fifth grade this year, one second and third grade. But they're at a level of their development in their life that they're very impressionable, and the way that you present yourself as a person really can go a long way. And I can definitely think back to when I was that age. Some specific teachers that really stood out to me. At the Atkinson School, I remember all my teachers for sure, but Mr. Sturdivant, DJ Sturdivant, he really stood out to me just because in an elementary school setting, predominantly female teachers. So just having a nice positive male influence really can go a long way. So I definitely try to pride myself on being that in the school that I work in, and really just trying to, yes, obviously, I have to teach the curriculum, I teach math and science, but to me, what's more important is the life skills aspect of it. Really just trying to hammer home, just be a great person, go out of your way to be kind to people, respect one another, and just really hope that those ideas and those philosophies they can take with them as they grow older and continue to develop.
That's great. Jimmy, we just had our 11-hour summer staff training. When you were with us, we didn't have it 11 hours. It was pretty impressive. We talk a lot about holding kids accountable and gratitude were a couple of big things. And you and I have we've had a long history, and not to get into specifics, but we've had our little rocky moments at times too. And we talked a little bit off air about just holding kids accountable and what it means at the moment and what it means over a period of time. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, absolutely. So I think at the end of the day, and like you said, as we talked off air, the whole concept of holding kids accountable, and you mentioned this idea, and I totally agree with it now that I'm in a different position myself, as an educator, as a teacher. They're not going to thank you then, but eventually they will. And I think it's a matter of not taking anything too personally and really just knowing that as that influence and you're really trying to hold them to that standard, you can't back down. And honestly, that was one thing that I was very thankful for. Maybe not at the moment when I was working here and when we kind of had those rocky moments, as you said. I wasn't necessarily thankful for that at the moment, but after a couple of years of reflection and again kind of going through my own growth process, I really just kind of realized, he was just doing it because, he loved me, he cared about me, he wanted me to succeed, he wanted me to be at that level that he knew I could be at. So then, I kind of came back and I had that discussion with you because you definitely deserve that. Just because growing up, and I mentioned a different podcast that I was listening to, they talk about, you kind of have some heroes throughout your life. And, my parents definitely are, number one and two for sure. But you're on that very short list of heroes, and I know we had that conversation, and I just felt like in order for me to kind of restore, and not that it was ever, you know, broken. Our relationship was never broken. But in order to get it back to what I knew it could be and what I wanted it to be, I just felt like that I needed to have that conversation with you.
Yeah, and it was a great moment for me. I tweet often that, hold kids accountable. They won't thank you today, but they will thank you sometime. We talked off here about our little situation, but also other people too. Sometimes it's an immediate response back. Other times it takes a couple of years. And I was just telling you about a nice visit from a 44-year-old man that I had when he was 18, and basically came to basically say, I know what you were trying to do when I was 18 years old. So I tell people out there, young teachers that get, a little depressed at times, that kids aren't treating them really well. They are going to come full cycle. Trust me on this. I've been doing this a long time. Jimmy, you do have a lot of inspiration just listening to your podcast. You can tell some people have been inspiring you, some books, some music. Maybe a quick minute on, where do you get some of your inspiration from?
Oh, well, definitely, I don't look much further than, even some of my students, even in the classroom and my colleagues. It's really amazing, what some of these young kids really can do. And, talking about, some of the messages that I was trying to, put forth. And I'll try to hold it together. I'll mention this one that really stood out to me this year, just knowing that not only I could make a difference, but this child made a difference in my life as well. I try to put up a quote every week, just for the kids to kind of chew on, think about throughout the week, and whether or not they feel like they did that. One of them was, be the change that you want to see in the world. And this girl and her sister, I had her and her sister in class. They were fourth and fifth grade. They gave me this water bottle, and they wrote on the entire thing. So as you turn the water bottle, you're reading, the messages that they sent, that they wrote, I should say. And I got halfway through it, and it said, "Thank you for being the change that we wanted to see in the world." And I just lost it at that point. So it was the last day of school. Like, I was just in my classroom, at that moment, and I just lost it. I just started crying. So I had to go shut my door and just kind of like have my own moment. But those kids inspire me to become a better person. So it definitely starts there, and just seeing the passion that my colleagues have, becoming educators as well, and like them being in the business and really seeing the influence that they can have on these kids. Definitely my parents are a big influence. Steve Boudreau growing up, always helping me at the youth center. Another one, oh my gosh, I got to mention this guy too. My mentor teacher, Matt Flynn, he was phenomenal, always so supportive during my student teaching days, always offering, constructive advice, but he did it in such a respectful and nice way. Like, he didn't look at me as, his subordinate. He looked at me as a colleague, like that we were on a level playing field. And this is a guy that's been teaching for 15 years, and he took me under his wing, and I'm brand new. I'm a student teacher. I don't know anything really, and he's just looking at me like we're at the same level, and he really just wanted me to continue to improve, and as far as, coaching goes, Dan is a big inspiration too. I know, him and we've definitely been working on our relationship as far as like becoming better coaches, but the passion that he has, and he just wants, the kids to be better. Not because he wants to win games, but like for them, just so they can get the most out of their experience. And people don't really need to look much further than like their inner circle, and that's kind of like, to me, that those are a lot of people that I can kind of look to, for inspiration. Those are all local people, and I'm sure there's definitely like some people on Instagram and Twitter that I like to follow and that I like to quote, but the true inspiration are the people around me, just because that's so much more local, and it's just so much more real.
As we wrap up the podcast here, we have a kind of a twofold question we want to end you in. We always allow our guests to have what we call the final word, but leading into the final word, could you talk a little bit about how Jimmy Warden is maybe a different person than that little kid that walked through our doors here? And then, with the same breath, on your final word, what's a message that you want to really say to, whether it's your students up in Vermont, it's the kids working here at the youth center, or people that have touched your life here in North Andover?
Yeah, well, he's definitely grown. That's one. But in all seriousness, though, I've definitely come a long way. I feel like in the way I think. We were talking about that, before we got on air, just kind of the way people think. When I was growing up, I think I was a lot more egotistical. I kind of felt like I was the big man on campus, so to say. And John Boudreau, I was listening to the podcast that you and John had, and he was so right. Even for him, he's 21, I believe. For him to have this insight, he was saying how leaders, when you're younger, it's often like they're kind of the bullies, essentially. And reflecting, I almost kind of felt like I put myself in some of those situations. We're not laughing with people; we're laughing at the expense of people. And as a teacher now, as an educator now, like I can't support that at all. So like, if we're gonna, I'll use this scenario. Like, if I was in my own classroom and I saw some of that action, I would definitely hold young Jimmy accountable for that, and I would try to let him know that he needs to empathize. I think that's another big thing with me as far as my growth, my progression. My ability to empathize now with people is much, much higher than it used to be. Really just trying to put myself in that other person's shoes and really trying to see it through their perspective before I make any judgments. So that's definitely another thing too. And going back to when the size of like certain problems and just trying to control the controllables. For me, I used to get flustered a lot about things that, quite frankly, were out of my control. And now, and you mentioned it earlier, but I really have been trying my best to, like, if it's something that I can't control, like, just let it go, because the negativity and that negative energy, the dwelling, that really kind of takes away from your greater purpose and like your ability to move forward with whatever it is you're trying to do. So I just try to let go on things that I need to let go on, and just focus on the bigger picture.
Well, Jimmy, this has been great. I actually really asked people if you like some of the things that Jimmy said today. He's a great follower on social media. I love the Wednesday Wisdom idea that he's doing, and hopefully he can try to get that up every week or every couple of weeks, because he has a different message every week. Love the growth, Jimmy. I've known you since you were a little kid, and the young man you become, I'm very proud of. I know your family very well. I know your parents and your siblings are proud of you too. Keep changing the world, one step at a time, up at that little community in Vermont. Obviously, the touching story you talked about with your student's gift. You're obviously making some strides there. And as we told our kids in training yesterday, you have an opportunity to change kids' lives, and obviously you're doing that every day. So continued success with that, and don't be a stranger when you come back down south here. Make sure you swing by the youth center and check things out. Things are going. Next week, next couple of weeks, we have a couple of people coming in. Long-awaited Bill Fahey, Director of Andover Youth Services, and a colleague of mine for the last 30 years. We'll be talking about kids today. And then also we're going to be having Marquise Victor come in from Elevated Thought, another one of our former kids doing some amazing work through art and spoken word and music and things like that. So thank you again for tuning in to Youth Centered Podcast. And as we finish every podcast, too much passion is not enough passion.